Berlin, 2017, a wooden crate arrives at the Japanese embassy. Inside it, one human skull. Removed from a burial ground on the northern island of Hokkaido sometime in the late 19th century. Transported to Germany by an academic society, catalogued, studied, shelved, and then forgotten for over 100 years. The Japanese government did not request its return because of a court ruling, not because of a treaty. A researcher noticed it in an archive catalog. That is the entire reason this skull got a crate. That is the entire reason it made it back across the ocean. And right now, as you watch this, that skull is sitting in a charnel house at Hokkaido University. Not returned to the Ainu community it was taken from. Still in an institution. Still not home. That is not ancient history. That is the present tense. Here is what makes this story different from every other DNA documentary you have seen about Japan's indigenous people. Most of those videos begin with the science. They treat the DNA as the story. This video treats the DNA as evidence. Evidence in something that is not finished. Hokkaido University holds over 1,000 sets of Ainu human remains, excavated from burial sites across Hokkaido throughout the 20th century. Not recovered, not inherited, excavated. In 2012, 3 Ainu individuals brought the first legal case against the university, demanding the return of 9 people's remains and a formal apology. What the court process confirmed was this: the excavations had been intentional, deliberate, and they were made possible by a 1934 Hokkaido prefectural regulation that had legally reclassified Ainu burial sites as something other than graves, which meant they could be emptied without legal consequence. A government regulation that reclassified graves, so they could be legally emptied. Hold that. Because the DNA extracted from remains like that skull in Berlin has now revealed something nobody in a 189 could have anticipated. A genetic lineage that has no living equivalent anywhere on the Asian continent. A Y-chromosome signal 38,000 years old. And the Japanese state spent 125 years trying to classify the people who carried it as extinct. If you have ever actually wondered where the oldest unbroken human lineages on Earth are hiding, not the textbook answer, the real one, subscribe. Because what we are about to trace goes much further than most people have been willing to go. Actually, before we go any further, I want to know something, and I am asking it genuinely. Drop it in the comments. Where are you watching from right now? And if you have any sense of your own deep ancestry, even just a feeling, write that too. Because what we are about to trace changes the picture for almost everyone in this part of the world. And your answer might be more connected to what I am about to say than you think. The lineage that someone called dying is called Y-chromosome haplogroup D1b. It is present at dominant frequency in Ainu men. It is almost entirely absent from mainland East Asia, China, Korea, the Russian Far East, all of it. You can travel the entire Asian continent and barely find it. But there are 2 other places on Earth where a related form shows up in meaningful numbers. One is the Tibetan Plateau. The other is the Andaman Islands, a remote chain in the Indian Ocean, roughly 1,000 miles off the coast of Myanmar. And the divergence between the Japanese form of this lineage and those nearest relatives is estimated at approximately 53,000 years. 53,000 years ago, these lineages shared a common ancestor. They then went in completely different directions. One reached Tibet. One reached islands in the Indian Ocean. One reached the Japanese archipelago. And in Japan, it stayed, isolated, unbroken, for tens of thousands of years. The people who wrote Dying Race into a legal document in 1899 did not know any of that. But they were studying the oldest continuous human lineage in East Asia, and calling it expendable. Hideaki Kanzawa Kiriyama and his team at Japan's National Museum of Nature and Science spent years sequencing ancient Jomon genomes from burial sites across the archipelago. Their 2019 work established something that had only been inferred before. The Jomon lineage diverged from continental East Asian populations between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, precisely when rising sea levels after the last glacial maximum cut the Japanese archipelago off from the Asian mainland. The isolation was not cultural, it was geographic. The ocean itself sealed them in. And from the Funadamari site on Rebun Island, Hokkaido, 2 hunter-gatherers who lived approximately 3,500 to 3,800 years ago. Both carried a specific mutation in a gene called CPT1A, a variant that gives metabolic advantages for processing a high-fat diet. Its frequency is above 70% in Arctic populations. It is essentially absent everywhere else on Earth. These were not generalized East Asians. They were a people shaped by this specific island, this specific cold, this specific ocean across thousands of years. Their genome reflects a life that cannot be generalized away. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. The effective population size of the Jomon through most of their occupation of the archipelago is estimated at roughly 1,000 individuals, 1,000 across 0 years, maintaining genetic coherence from Hokkaido to Kyushu. That is not a declining population. That is extraordinary cohesion under extraordinary pressure. And the single mutation in a burial on Rebun Island carries a cold climate adaptation that is still appearing in the metabolic profiles of modern Japanese today. The lineage that was declared extinct had already survived an ice age. Here is where the story gets complicated, and I mean that in the best possible way. If the Ainu were simply direct descendants of the Jomon, the story would be clean. Ancient people, long isolation. Modern science confirms it, that would be the end. But that is not what the DNA shows. The Ainu genome is not a pure Jomon genome. It carries a second signal, one that came from somewhere else entirely. And when you find out where it came from, the story stops being about survival and starts being about collision. Between the 5th and 13th centuries CE, a culture called the Okhotsk people occupied the coastal areas of northern and northeastern Hokkaido, as well as southern Sakhalin. They were not Jomon descendants. A whole genome analysis of a 900-year-old Okhotsk individual from the Hamanaka II site on Rebun Island, published by Takahiro Sato and colleagues at Kanazawa University in 2025, showed that approximately 60% of that individual's ancestry traced back to the Amur Basin, what is now the Russian Far East. The remaining ancestry carried Jomon and Kamchatka-related signals, with the Jomon-Kamchatka mixing estimated to have occurred around 2,000 years ago, before the Amur migration even arrived. Think about what that means. The Okhotsk people themselves were already a product of earlier collision. Jomon peoples who had moved north meeting Paleo-Siberian populations from Kamchatka, and then that already mixed population came south into Hokkaido and encountered the Jomon-descended Satsumon culture. What emerged from that contact, over centuries, is what we now recognize genetically as the Ainu, and yet, the data said the exact opposite of what the Meiji narrative needed. The admixture that shaped the Ainu happened just 17 to 25 generations ago, less than 500 years, which means the genetic identity of the Ainu as we recognize it today was still being formed while the Matsumai domain was already trading with Ainu, communities on Hokkaido's southern coast. The people whose culture the Meiji government later declared prehistoric were, genetically speaking, still actively becoming who they were. The Ainu genome carries roughly 79% Jomon ancestry, the highest of any living population on Earth. The Okhotsk signal adds northern depth, connecting them through the Amur Basin to the Nivki and Ulchi peoples of the Russian Far East. They are not a remnant of one ancient population. They are the living result of multiple ancient populations choosing each other. That is not a dying race. That is a people who absorbed every world that reached them. And the unnamed people in this story, the ones who shaped this collision, and vanished without a successor civilization, are the Okhotsk, a culture that contributed to the Ainu genome and left no name anyone remembers. Before 1869, the island was called Ezo. That name matters. Ezo was not Japan. It was not administered as Japan. For centuries under the Tokugawa shogunate, the Ainu of Ezo maintained a distinct political relationship with the Matsumai domain, a Japanese feudal domain at the island's southern tip that controlled trade. The Ainu fished, the Ainu hunted, the Ainu traded. They were not subjects of the Japanese emperor. They were a sovereign people in commerce with a neighboring power. Then 1868 happened, the Meiji Restoration. Japan's new government looked north and saw a strategic frontier. Russia was expanding eastward, and the archipelago that the Ainu had occupied for tens of thousands of years was declared terra nullius, land belonging to no one, in 1872, redistributed to Japanese settlers, renamed Hokkaido. The people who had been there for 38,000 years became, in the language of state policy, obstacles, not enemies. Obstacles, that specific framing matters. You do not wage war on obstacles, you reclassify them. The 1899 Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act called them former Aborigines, not current, former. The word was doing legal work. It meant, whatever you were, you are no longer that. You are now something in transition to becoming Japanese. The law was not describing a reality. It was legislating one into existence. Under that law, Ainu children were required to attend schools where their language was forbidden. Salmon fishing, the economic and spiritual foundation of Ainu life, was banned. Deer hunting was banned. Traditional tattoos were banned. The Amante, the bear ceremony, the most sacred ritual in Ainu spiritual life, was declared barbarous and prohibited. That ban on the Ayomante lasted until 2007, and the language. The Ainu language has no known relatives anywhere in the world. It is a linguistic isolate, unconnected to Japanese, to the Tungusic languages of the Amur, to any known language family on Earth. It is the spoken record of a people who were in that archipelago before anyone else had a writing system for this part of the world. The 1899 law banned it in schools. The social cost it created was so effective that Ainu parents stopped teaching it to their own children, not because they wanted to, but because they had learned what speaking it would cost them. Today, fewer than 15 native Ainu speakers are alive. All of them are over 60 years old. This is not the distant past. The last generation of fluent speakers is alive right now. Here are some things most people who know about the Ainu have never been told. The genetic boundary between Ainu and mainland Japanese is not a gradual gradient. It is a line. A sharp discontinuity that shows up in every genomic analysis of Japanese population structure. On a principal component analysis, the standard visualization geneticists use to show how populations cluster, the Ainu sit apart. Not slightly apart, clearly apart. They cluster with the Jomon reference genomes. Mainland Japanese cluster between the Jomon and continental East Asian populations, reflecting the Yayoi admixture that reshaped the archipelago's gene pool roughly 700 to 2200 years ago. That Yayoi migration, rice farmers arriving predominantly from the Korean peninsula, is the dominant ancestry event in modern Japanese genetics. It reduced Jomon ancestry in mainland Japanese to somewhere between 13% and 20% depending on the region. The Ainu, 79% Jomon. The continental wave that washed across the rest of the archipelago essentially stopped at them. And now here's the part that connects this to you. And I mean that literally, not metaphorically. In 2024, Shigeki Nakagomi at Trinity College Dublin, working with biobank data from over 171,000 Japanese participants, published a study in Nature Communications that confirmed something extraordinary. The Jomon genetic legacy is not inert. It is not sitting quietly in a genome doing nothing. Jomon ancestry is associated with elevated body mass index in modern Japanese populations. The cold climate metabolic adaptations carried by those hunter-gatherers on Rebun Island 800 years ago are still influencing health outcomes in living people today. This isn't just ancient history. This is in your DNA right now. If you have any East Asian ancestry at all, if your family traces back anywhere in this part of the world, a fraction of what we are talking about is already inside you. The Jomon did not disappear when the Yayoi arrived. They were absorbed. Their genome filtered into a population that now numbers over 100 million people. You may carry a trace of the oldest continuous lineage in East Asia and have no name for it. The Ainu carry the concentrated form of what everyone else diluted. That is what the Meiji government's researchers were looking at when they wrote Dying Race in their academic papers. A genome 38,000 years deep, carrying cold weather adaptations that still show up in modern metabolic data, preserving a haplogroup that connects 3 of the most isolated human populations on Earth. And their conclusion, their official scientific conclusion, was that this population had no viable future and should be absorbed. The unfinished war here is not military. It is the one between what the science actually says and what the state needed it to say. And that war has not ended. The genomic data is on one side. The charnel house at Hokkaido University is on the other. I want to do something uncomfortable for a moment. I want to make the strongest possible case for the other side, because it deserves to be made, and because destroying it properly requires building it properly first. The argument goes like this. The 1899 Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act was not conceived as malicious. The Meiji officials who drafted it understood themselves to be managing a genuine welfare problem. The Ainu communities of the late 19th century were facing economic collapse. Their traditional hunting and fishing territories were being settled by Japanese migrants. Their trade networks were breaking down and their population was declining. The law allocated them land. It provided schools. In the context of 19th century colonial administration, this was considered progressive governance. Even the word protection was not cynical to everyone who used it. And the scientific research conducted on Ainu remains, disturbing as the methods did produce real knowledge. The genomic understanding we now have of Jomon ancestry, of D1b haplogroup distribution, of the Okhotsk admixture. Some of that foundational data came from work done on remains held in Japanese universities. The knowledge exists. It is real. It has contributed to a broader understanding of East Asian population history that benefits researchers and communities across the region. And finally, the Ainu are still here. A people the state declared former in 1899 are present in Hokkaido today. Their language revival projects exist. Their legal rights were formally recognized by the Japanese government in 2019. The erasure failed. And perhaps, the argument goes that partial survival is itself evidence that the policies were less than total. That is the strongest version of that argument. Now here's what the evidence actually shows. The land allocated under the 1899 Act was marginal agricultural plots. The best land had already been transferred to Japanese settlers before the Act was passed. The schools provided education in a language that was not the student's own, specifically designed to sever the transmission of Ainu knowledge. The scientific research was conducted on remains taken under a provincial regulation that had deliberately reclassified Ainu burial sites as non-graves to make their excavation legal. Consent was not sought because the legal framework had been constructed to make consent unnecessary. And the knowledge produced? The researchers who published Dying Race were working from the same bones. The science was used for decades to justify the policy. The same institutions produced both the harm and, later, the refutation of the harm. And the Ainu are not still here because the policies failed. They are still here because human beings are harder to erase than laws anticipate. Those are different things. One is a policy outcome. The other is an act of survival that happened despite the policy, not because of it. Here is the missing variable in every version of this argument that calls the 1899 Act misguided but well-intentioned. The 1934 Hokkaido prefectural regulation that reclassified Ainu graves. That regulation did not exist by accident. Someone wrote it. Someone signed it. Someone used it. And the remains taken under it are still in university storage today. Not because no one has noticed. Because the legal framework for returning them, community by community, with full repatriation to origin sites, has not been built. This actually connects directly to something we looked at in our last video, the way genomic evidence gets used after the fact to reframe what a state did to a people. If you watch that one, you know exactly what I mean. Drop in the comments whether you think the science arriving late changes anything about the moral weight of what happened. I want to know what you think, because this next part is where it gets even harder to look away. Now we reach the part of this story that I have been building toward since the first frame. The Japanese universities that spent the 20th century excavating Ainu burial sites, that published papers arguing the Ainu were a dying race, destined for biological absorption into the Japanese population. Those same institutions, using those same remains or remains exactly like them, produced the genomic evidence that now still makes that argument scientifically indefensible. Think about the structure of that sentence for a moment. The proof that the Ainu were never what their erasers claimed was extracted from the bodies that the erasure project collected. The instrument of the harm became involuntarily the instrument of its own refutation. Noboru Adachi and his colleagues at Tohoku University published their analysis of ancient Ainu mitochondrial DNA in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in 2018. What they found confirmed something earlier work had suggested, but not settled. The genetic characteristics of the Ainu are built on a Hokkaido Jomon foundation, with subsequent northern input through the Okkotsk culture people from the lower Amur region. The Ainu are not a degraded or absorbed version of some other population. They are the primary Jomon lineage in its most preserved form, layered with northern Siberian depth that only deepens their distinctiveness. And then there is this, the dual structure model of Japanese population history, the standard academic framework that held that modern Japanese, formed through Jomon and Yayoi admixture, with the Ainu as a marginal outlier, has now been revised. Recent high-coverage genome work from multiple Jomon sites estimates Jomon ancestry in mainland Japanese at approximately 20%, substantially higher than the previous estimate of 13%. The Jomon contribution to the modern Japanese genome is larger than anyone officially acknowledged for most of the 20th century. The institutions that argued the Jomon were being absorbed, that the Ainu were the last trace of a disappearing lineage. They were underestimating the Jomon contribution to the very population they were. Comparing the Ainu to, here is the inverted truth. The dying race narrative required the Jomon to be disappearing. The genomic data shows the Jomon lineage is woven into over 125 million living people, in reduced concentration in mainland Japanese, in high concentration in the Ainu, in the metabolic profiles and body mass indices of people who have no idea their ancestor spent a winter on Rebun Island 3,800 years ago eating seal fat. The lineage did not die. It propagated. It diluted in some directions. It concentrated in others. And the place it concentrated most was exactly the community someone decided to call former. That is not a poetic irony. That is a forensic finding. In 2024, the Japanese government officially recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people. It took until 2019 for that recognition to be written into law, 120 years after a different law had legally erased that status. The Upapoi National Ainu Museum opened in Shiraui, Hokkaido in July 2020, a national museum, a formal cultural space. The language is on the signs. The ceremonies are represented. There is a memorial facility nearby for Ainu remains that have been consolidated from universities across Japan. That memorial facility is also where the remains currently are, consolidated, not repatriated, not returned to the communities and origin sites they were taken from, because that process, community by community, burial ground by burial ground, is incomplete. Roughly 1/600 sets of Ainu skeletal remains have been documented across 12 Japanese universities. The legal and institutional framework for returning all of them, fully and directly, to the communities they came from does not yet exist in its complete form. The Upapoi facility was built, in part, as a place where they could be held while that framework was developed. Some Ainu community members and advocates view the facility as a genuine step. Others view it as a way to gesture at repatriation without completing it. Both things can be true at the same time. Here is the inherited trauma in this data, and I mean that in the most specific genomic sense. Takehiro Sato and his colleagues at Kanazawa University, in their 2025 analysis of early Okhotsk genomes, identified HLA typing data in one individual that showed an allele associated with elevated risk of arthritis, and noted that hyperostosis, the condition associated with that allele, was visible in the skeletal remains they were analyzing. The genome carried the risk. The bones showed the consequence. A disease marker in the DNA of a person who lived 900 years ago, visible in the physical evidence of what that person's body went through, studied in a laboratory in 2025. That is what a genome is. It is not an abstraction. It is a record of what a specific body did, what it processed, what it resisted, what it inherited, what it passed forward. The Ainu genome is a record of 38,000 years of specific decisions, specific migrations, specific winters, specific adaptations. It is the most complete deep ancestry record of any living East Asian population. And the most comprehensive studies of that genome were conducted by researchers working in institutions that also hold the bones of the people whose descendants are asking for them back. That tension has not been resolved. There is no clean ending here. The science got further than the justice did. I want to come back to Berlin, not the skull specifically, what the skull represents. Because there is something in the structure of this story that I think is worth sitting with before we end. A person was buried on Hokkaido at some point in the 19th century. That burial was found by someone connected to a European academic institution who understood that Ainu remains were scientifically interesting. The person was removed from their grave, legally, under a framework that had been designed to make that removal legal, and transported to Germany, where they were catalogued and studied and then shelved when the project was complete. And then, 130 years later, a researcher looking through an old catalog noticed the entry and flagged it, and the skull was shipped back in a wooden crate and placed in a facility at the same university that held over 1,000 other Ainu remains. That is not a story about science. That is a story about what happens when one group of people has the institutional power to decide that another group's dead do not belong to them. And here is the thing about the DNA. The DNA does not care about any of that. The DNA in a skull taken from a Hokkaido burial ground and stored in Berlin for 100 years carries exactly the same information as it would if the skull had never been disturbed. The haplogroup does not change. The ancient cold climate adaptations do not degrade. The 38,000 year lineage does not shorten. The genome is indifferent to the crime that preserved it for study. But we are not indifferent. And that is the thing that the science cannot resolve and was never designed to resolve. There may be a person watching this right now who carries haplogroup D1b and does not know it. There may be someone watching this with Japanese ancestry, mainland or Ryukyuan or Okinawan, who carries 15% or 20% Jomon ancestry and has never has name for that part of their genome. There may be someone watching from the Russian Far East whose Nivki or Olchi ancestry carries the Okhotsk signal that is also present in the Ainu. The lineages in this story are not confined to one community. They were distributed across migrations we are still mapping. What belongs only to the Ainu is the right to decide what happens to their ancestors. That right has not been fully returned. The science that proved the Ainu were never what their erasers claimed was extracted from bones that are, still in significant numbers, held in university storage. The genomic knowledge is complete. The repatriation is not. Fewer than 15 people alive today speak the language that was carried by the same lineage for 38,000 years before a law banned it from being taught to children. The skull that came back from Berlin in a wooden crate is at Hokkaido University, right now. It is being held with care, the university president said. It will be looked after with dignity until the Ainu people decide its final resting place. The Ainu people already know its final resting place. They have always known.